She lived alone, but one day she took in someone. A strange kitten appeared, and over the days it grew surprisingly quickly. What at first seemed like a helpless pet revealed its true nature when some thieves tried to break into the house. At that moment it became clear it wasn't a common cat. This is a story of kindness, loyalty, and of a wild predator that found a home and decided to protect it. The story took place in the village of Podgornaya, a place hidden among hills, covered with green in summer and sleeping under snow in winter. On the outskirts of the village, among thick thickets of wild cherry trees, stood an old log house. The shutters were crooked, the porch creaked with every step, and the walls, blackened by years and seasons, still held the warmth of the stove and the aromas of times past. Dried mushrooms, mint, warm milk, freshly baked bread. There lived Agafia, an elderly woman who was the last of her family and the last to have cows in that region. At another time, her house overflowed with life, children's laughter, dishes clinking together, the creaking of boards under her husband's heavy boots. But the years took everything away. The children grew up and left. Her husband died of an illness that neither healers nor doctors could cure. The grandchildren barely called, and visits became increasingly rare. In the city, life spun fast. There, time ran like a river in full flood. In contrast, in Agafia's house, time slipped slowly like thick honey. Her only companions were the yard benches and a group of cats. Every morning she served them food, fish puree, porridge with milk, bread soaked in warm broth for those who could no longer chew. Then she checked the house, making sure everything was in order. In the evenings she sat by the stove, knitted or read old books, and told stories to her cats. She spoke to them about how the house used to smell of pastries. On Sundays, how the children ran around the yard, and how her husband built the furniture that was still standing. The cats listened to her, one sleeping, another looking at her with green or yellow eyes. She petted their heads and told them, "You are so good to me." It's not that people had completely forgotten her, but she missed them deeply. Sometimes she found herself talking alone, evoking the grandchildren's laughter, or talking to her deceased husband whom she had buried under a torrential rain, next to her daughter who barely called from the city. One autumn afternoon, when rain was pounding the roof and wind was sweeping yellow leaves down the street, Agafia was returning from the market. She carried a heavy bag with bread and groceries, and the mud made each step more difficult. She was about to reach home when she heard a faint whimper, a weak and pitiful sound that forced her to stop. She frowned, left the bags on the porch, and listened again. It came from under the porch. She crouched down, moved aside some wet boards, and there, in the darkness and on the wet ground, was curled up a small grey bundle. It was a kitten so dirty and soaked that you couldn't even distinguish the color of its fur. It was trembling and looking at her with enormous yellow eyes, as if silently asking, "Will you take me with you, lady?" Agafia extended her hand carefully, expecting the kitten to get scared or flee, but it didn't. Instead, it slowly approached and rested its small nose on her palm. It let out another sad meow. Then she took it in her arms. It was as light as a feather, as cold as autumn rain. The kitten pressed against her chest, seeking warmth, seeking a place to feel safe. "Let's go home, poor little one," the grandmother murmured. Inside, everything was calm. The other cats were sleeping, and she, without knowing it yet, had changed her destiny and also that of the small being she had just taken in. Barsik slept peacefully on the stove. Maska watched the world from the windowsill, and the other cats occupied their favorite corners in the house. As soon as they sensed an unknown smell, they startled. One of them raised its head and stared. The grandmother wrapped the small kitten in an old rag to clean it, and then dried it with a warm towel. As she rubbed it carefully, its previously dirty and matted fur revealed a very particular ash color, with dark rings on the tail and barely visible stripes on the paws. "You're not just any kitten," the grandmother murmured, just as the little one sneezed and weakly pushed her hand with its nose. It was hungry. The grandmother warmed some milk, served it in a small dish, and placed it in front of the new guest. First it sniffed it cautiously, but then, as if fearing it would be taken away, it lunged to drink desperately, to the point of coughing from the speed. Obviously you haven't eaten in a long time, the grandmother sighed. When it finished, she picked it up gently and checked its ears, eyes and paws. It was healthy, just very hungry and above all alone. "And you, where is your mother?" she asked aloud. The kitten responded with a weak purr. It wasn't from fear or hunger, it seemed to be from pure pleasure. "All right, you're going to live here," she told it with a smile. She prepared a small nest with an old basket and a warm blanket, but the newcomer didn't take long to get out. It walked with trembling steps to where she was, sat at her feet, and looked at her fixedly with its yellow eyes. "What character you have," the grandmother laughed, picking it up again. The kitten settled on her chest, curled up and closed its eyes. Soon it fell asleep. The next morning the other cats met the new tenant. Barsik was the first to approach, important with its tail erect. It sniffed it, snorted, and walked away. With disdain. Maska observed from a corner. Dusia, more prudent, inspected it carefully. Vaska, on the other hand, showed unexpected tolerance. It limited itself to licking its ear before walking away. Pelusa, after observing it for a long time, lay down beside it and began licking its back. "You see," said the grandmother, petting the new family member, "you're not alone, kitten." She had already named it mentally, Senka. The little one seemed to understand, rubbed against her palm and began to purr. Days passed, then weeks, and Senka grew rapidly. It was gluttonous. It ate everything it was given and always asked for more. Its fur became clean and fluffy, of a silver tone with dark spots on the chest and paws, as if it were a small leopard. It had large round eyes of an intense yellow with vertical pupils that observed the world with a strange intelligence, almost non-feline. "You are unusual," the grandmother would tell it while petting it. It would purr, climb onto her lap and sleep curled up in a ball. After a month, it had already surpassed all the other cats in size. Its paws were large, its tail thick, and its body heavy. The neighbors who came by to look for herbs or simply to chat noticed it. "That's not a cat," said Grandfather Nikifor. "That looks like a lynx or some forest animal." The grandmother told them it was a common cat, but sometimes, she herself wondered, Senka didn't play with balls of yarn or chase shadows or rays of sun. It didn't fight with the other cats except with Barsik for the best place in the kitchen. It preferred to observe the forest from the window or follow the grandmother wherever she went, as if protecting her. One day she slipped in the wet mud of the yard. Senka appeared immediately, looking at her with such an intense expression that it seemed human. "I'm fine, son," she whispered while petting its head. It purred and rubbed its cheek against the grandmother's hand. That night it stayed at her feet as always, but first it looked at her for a long time with its enormous yellow eyes, as if trying to tell her something. And then winter arrived in Podgorno unexpectedly. One morning Grandmother Agafia woke up to an unusual silence. Outside, everything was covered by thick white snow that absorbed sounds. Only the tracks of some birds could be seen marked on the virgin surface of the yard. The house was warm, wrapped under the silent mantle of snow. The cats dozed peacefully in their usual corners, all except Senka. It remained motionless by the window like a statue, with its gaze fixed on the forest. Its yellow eyes shone with an intensity that seemed to see beyond what any human could reach. "What are you looking at there?" asked the grandmother as she approached. Senka slowly turned its head, looked at her in silence, and then refocused its attention toward the outside. The grandmother sighed resignedly and continued with her morning tasks. She threw wood in the stove, prepared and served food for the cats. One by one they began to wake up and approach their bowls. Barsik, the red cat, sat on the stove but didn't take his eyes off Senka. His fur bristled slightly. His ears were back and his tail trembled with nervousness. "Come on, go eat," said the grandmother. But Barsik didn't move. He only growled softly when Senka finally moved away from the window and walked toward its bowl. "What's wrong with them today?" thought Agafia, puzzled. She soon realized that the other cats also acted unusually. Maska didn't even approach its food while Senka was nearby. Dusia moved away with discomfort, and even Pelusa, normally friendly, avoided crossing its path. Vaska, the most impassive of all, also preferred to keep distance. Senka, for its part, seemed oblivious to all this. It ate calmly, with dignity, without the anxiety of the others. Then it approached the grandmother, rubbed against her leg, and lay down by the stove, rolled up in a large, fluffy ball. Days passed, and the oddities became more evident. The other cats clearly avoided Senka. If it took the stove, the others left for the windowsill. If it passed through the hallway, Dusia immediately backed away. Even Vaska, normally imperturbable, chose to stay on the sidelines. The grandmother also noticed other things. Senka never meowed. It only emitted a low purr, almost like the hum of a tiny motor. It didn't make the typical sounds of cats, and you couldn't even hear it when running. Sometimes Agafia had the unsettling feeling that Senka was watching her like a person, as if it understood every word. "Bring me some thread," she told it one day, more in jest than necessity. Senka raised its head, looked at the basket where thread was usually kept, but didn't move. "All right, maybe you don't understand," the grandmother laughed. But that same night, when the grandmother started coughing and got up from the chair, Senka appeared immediately at her side, pressing against her as if fearing she would fall. Its eyes fixed on hers showed disturbing anxiety. "It's nothing, son," she told it, petting its head. "Old age is not an illness." It purred, but its pupils remained narrow, alert. The neighbors also began to murmur, intrigued by Senka's behavior. "Agafia, what kind of animal is that?" asked Marfa, looking inside the house. "It looks like a cat, but it isn't." "It's just a cat," the grandmother responded, dismissing it. "A cat," shook his head Grandfather Nikifor. "Look at those paws, that tail like a brush, and those eyes like an owl's." In those moments, Senka usually stayed completely still. It only moved its ears as if listening to every word. And when the visitors left, it approached the grandmother and brushed her palm with its snout as if saying, "Don't listen to them." "I don't care what you are," she whispered, petting behind its ear. "You are you, and that's enough." But one night, Agafia woke up to a strange sound. It was a low growl, a hoarse whisper coming from the yard. When she turned in bed, she noticed that Senka was no longer at her side. She went to the window, pushed the curtain, and froze at the scene that the moonlight revealed. Senka was there, standing with its back arched, fur bristled, and tail fluffed like a feather duster. From its throat came a deep, threatening growl. A few steps away in the snow, a large red fox was watching it with predatory eyes. It had black paws and a cunning, sly smile. Not even dogs scared the foxes in that area. But this one backed away. Senka took a step toward it, and the fox stepped back. Another step, and the fox turned and disappeared into the darkness. For a few seconds, Senka remained there, watching the direction in which its opponent had fled. Then slowly it turned around and walked toward the grandmother's house. I hurried back to bed when the door creaked and heavy footsteps were heard on the wood. I pretended to be half asleep. Senka approached silently, stopped beside me, and then carefully licked my hand before settling at my feet. "You are not a cat," I whispered to myself while the wind stirred the snow on the other side of the window, as if wanting to erase the traces of that strange night. The next morning, seeing it in daylight, I noticed that its fur was thicker than that of any other cat. It had a dense undercoat, almost like that of a wild animal. Its ears were slightly larger, rounded with small tufts, and its eyes were not the eyes of a common cat. That winter, Podgorny became restless. First, Grandfather Nikifor's hen disappeared. Then Marfa's supplies disappeared from the basement. The neighbors murmured that maybe a pack of stray dogs was prowling around, or even a wolf came down from the forest. But there were no tracks, only smooth snow, as if someone had bothered to carefully sweep away all traces. Grandmother Agafia listened to those comments while drinking tea sitting on a bench by the stove, and cast furtive glances at Senka, who slept curled up in a grey and enormous ball at her feet, or at least pretended to sleep. "Go out for a walk, creature," she would tell it while petting behind its ear. "You're going to roast here like a little snow leopard." Senka barely opened one eye, looked at her reproachfully, and went back to sleep. At night, when she went to bed, it would go out silently to the yard. Sometimes she managed to see its shadow disappear into the darkness, and then in the distance, She heard the snow crunch under its heavy paws. In the mornings she found strange things on the porch, a small rabbit, a partridge. "What a hunter you are," the grandmother would say, shaking her head. Senka watched her closely, licking its paw, satisfied with its trophy. That night, the grandmother woke up to a silence that was too deep. Not even the stove crackled, only the howling of the wind could be heard. Suddenly she perceived a soft sound, not of a cat, but of human breathing, of furtive steps on the floor. "Senka," she whispered, but got no response. She was about to get up when she heard a different creak. The old house groaned slightly, and then a tapping was heard, as if someone was checking the door latch. Agafia remained motionless. Why lock the door if everyone was trustworthy? But now her fingers went by themselves to the axe by the stove. Another creak, a stronger blow, and then a deep, profound roar like that of a bear, not a meow. The grandmother jumped out of bed just as a piercing scream burst from the door. The sound of hurried footsteps was heard, a second scream, and a fierce roar that made the window glass vibrate. She hurried to open them. Two large men dressed in dark clothes were struggling in front of the porch. One of them was desperately waving a knife, covering his face with his hands. Between them, blocking the exit, was Senka, but it wasn't the same Senka that slept on her pillow. Its fur was bristled. The yellow eyes shone like two lanterns. Long fangs protruded from its open mouth. Its growl was not that of a cat. Every sound it emitted seemed like a whip against the intruders. One of the men brandished the knife and took a step forward. What Senka did was not a jump, but a quick and strange movement, as if it glided through the air. The knife whistled, without touching it. In an instant the beast was already behind its aggressor. A piercing scream was heard, and the grandmother saw dark drops staining the snow. "Let's run!" shouted the other man, and both fled staggering, leaving behind a trail of blood. Senka chased them a few steps, then stopped and turned toward the grandmother. Their gazes met. "Come here," she said, trembling. Senka approached. Its fur was wet, and a dark stain was visible on its chest. It was its blood. When it crossed the threshold of the house, it seemed as if all its strength abandoned it. It staggered, and the grandmother barely managed to hold it before it fell. "It's under the belly, silly," she whispered, sitting on the floor with it in her arms. Senka caressed her weakly with its paw. The next morning, the village was in turmoil. They had found two men on the road, one with his face torn, the other with deep scratches on his arms and neck. They murmured incoherent things about a demonic cat, a gigantic beast, and no one doubted Senka again. Grandfather Nikifor was standing at the threshold of his house, spinning his hat between his hands. "They say you have a beast here," he commented, in a serious tone. "A cat," the grandmother replied calmly. "A normal cat." "What kind of cat?" insisted Nikifor, looking toward the interior. From the shadows of the room, two yellow eyes peered out and quickly disappeared. Nikifor took a step back. "All right, be careful," he murmured and left. The grandmother closed the door and turned around. Senka was in the middle of the room, licking a paw. Its chest showed a wound covered by a scab. It was superficial, but still visible. "Come here," she told it. Senka approached docilely. The grandmother moistened a cloth in warm water and carefully cleaned the fur around the wound. "Silly," she repeated, while it purred and rubbed its head against hers. Spring came early that year. The snow melted quickly, leaving wet roads and the first green shoots on the house's porch. But despite the warm sun, tension reigned in the village since the incident with the thieves. No one spoke in low voices anymore. The rumors grew. "That's not a cat, it's a predator," they said. "I've seen one like it in the zoo," commented Grandfather Nikifor while sitting on the pile of wood next to the store. "They call them Pallas. Cats, wild and dangerous, they can bite you." "You're exaggerating," Marta interrupted with a gesture, but in her voice there was a slight doubt. Although it protected the grandmother, that's good. Grandmother Agafia listened to all those comments but didn't get involved. She stayed at home, darning an old sweater while watching Senka. It was lying on the floor, stretched out, lazily watching a fly that flew under the ceiling. The sunlight fell on its thick grey fur, revealing dark rings on its tail and enormous, paws with long, sharp claws. It didn't look like a common cat. "What kind of animal are you?" the grandmother asked in a low voice. Senka turned its head and looked at her with its yellow eyes with vertical pupils. In them, there was no anger or fierceness, only calm and understanding. The next day, a veterinarian arrived from the regional center. He was a thin man with glasses. They took him directly to the grandmother's house. "Are you Agafia?" the young neighbor asked, pointing toward the house. "She's the one who has a real beast living with her." The veterinarian smiled. "Well, show me this beast." The grandmother received him on the porch with crossed arms. "What do you need?" "We were informed that there's a wild animal here," the veterinarian replied politely. "We need to check it for safety." "Dangerous? Not dangerous, it doesn't matter," the grandmother replied. "It's mine," and she let him in. Senka was by the stove. From the first moment, its gaze left the veterinarian paralyzed. The man slowly removed his glasses, cleaned them, and put them back on. "It's a palace cat," he finally said, as if he couldn't believe it. "A wild cat from the steppes. There are none in this region. The nearest population is 1,000 kilometers away." The grandmother watched him silently while the veterinarian approached cautiously. It didn't arch its back or hiss. It simply looked at him attentively. "Incredible," the veterinarian murmured, examining it. "It's a healthy adult male. How did it get to you?" "I found it under the rain," the grandmother replied briefly. "It should be in a zoo or in a reserve. It's a rare species. It's in the Red Book." Senka turned its head and looked at him fixedly. The veterinarian stepped back. "It doesn't want to," the grandmother said firmly. "I took care of it, I fed it, and if it wants to leave, it will leave on its own." The veterinarian wanted to say something, but met Senka's gaze and remained silent. A minute later, he picked up his briefcase. "Well, be careful. It's still a wild animal." "It's not," the grandmother replied, dismissing him with a gesture. That night, the grandmother sat on the porch by the door, watching the sun set behind the forest. Senka was beside her, with its heavy head resting on her knees. She petted it tenderly. "So it turns out you're a rare beast," she murmured, scratching behind an ear. Senka purred loudly, as if its purr were distant thunder. It raised its head and looked into her eyes. Then slowly, as if wanting to give her time to understand, it brought its wrinkled nose to the grandmother's cheek. She laughed softly, with that calm laugh of those who have lived much and understood everything, even monsters. Meanwhile, in the village, a news story was already circulating, that of the old woman who had tamed a wild beast. The neighbors passed, more slowly in front of her house, and now greeted her with respect. Some children even threw pieces of meat into the garden as offerings for the palace cat. Senka accepted these gifts but never ate in front of people. It collected them and took them inside to share them only with her. Spring passed, summer arrived. One morning the grandmother woke up with a strange feeling. The house was unusually quiet. She sat up in bed. Senka wasn't in its usual corner. She went out to the porch, looked around, and then saw it. It was sitting on a hill bathed in sunlight, right at the edge of the forest, looking into the distance. Not at the village, not at the house. It was looking beyond towards something invisible to the human eye. The grandmother approached silently. "What's wrong, son? Do you feel the call?" she asked sweetly. Senka turned its head and looked at her. In its eyes there was no sadness or fear, only understanding, a melancholic tranquility. She sat beside it and petted its back. "If you want to leave, Senka," she whispered. It closed its eyes, rubbed against her hand, and then stood up. The grandmother also got up and walked with it to the forest's edge. Her heart didn't cry, but it was heavy. At the edge of the trees, Senka stopped, turned, and looked at her one last time. She nodded with a sad smile. "You are free." Senka contemplated her for one more instant, then turned and disappeared into the thicket. The grandmother sighed, adjusted her headscarf, and returned home. That night, while having a cup of tea on the porch, a grey shadow emerged from the darkness. Senka returned with a freshly caught hare between its teeth, left it at her feet, and lay down beside her as if it had never left. The grandmother smiled, petted its face. She no longer saw it as a cat, not even as a wild animal. It was the beast that one day heard the call of kindness and decided to stay. From then on, Senka lived with grandmother Agafia. Every morning, it greeted her with its soft purr. Every afternoon, it warmed her legs with its thick fur. It wasn't just a cat, nor was it just an animal. It became part of her life, part of her heart. A faithful, loyal soul. And it all began with something as simple as the desire to help a small trembling bundle curled up under the rain.